Hello everyone, a slightly newer type of video today. From the Notitia Dignitatum series, I made a couple of videos about this very important document from the late Roman Empire, the list of offices, providing detailed information about the administrative structure of both the Western and the Eastern Roman empires, and most importantly from a military point of view. This, however, went as far as just showing like the very famous shield ensigns units for how they've been handed down to us, also from the medieval manuscript tradition, varying in colors and rendition, sometimes even in the name actually of the units listed. But you know that this is basically a priceless, and actually a unique source as far as the few surviving records of the Roman government, covering a wide range of positions, including those in imperial court, provincial governments, diplomatic missions, not just the army units, right? But the latter is the one we're sort of more interested in. And the source in itself has actually a sort of mind-blowing background, because it's thought today that essentially this book circulated as it was copied on huge posters that were basically shown publicly, right, on walls, right, and showing the might of the empire, right. We are talking essentially about there is a bit of divide actually between the two pieces. Today video is not about the Notitia Dignitatum as a whole in general, but I made a video on that. And as we explained, there's a chronological divide, right? For the western half of the empire, we essentially consider this source accurate for the 20s of the 5th century, while for the eastern part, from the 90s of the previous one, of the 4th, the text itself does not provide a specific date. Also, the authors are unknown. Omissions within the document made it challenging to determine its exact date solely based on its content. This is not so important. But today, right, I wanted to start, generally speaking, the list of some of the repenses, and properly in more generic terms, we'll see now, Limitanei units of some provinces of the empire, and specifically the dukes, various duchess, right? Of the following regions, there are the first and second one of Rhaetia, the Duke of Second Moesia, the one of Mesopotamia, the one of Arabia, and the one of Thebais, right? And we will cover actually all the other, the comitatenses, etc., of all the various provinces at some point, but I thought to just make multiple videos out of this so that we can focus each time on sort of different aspects of these various provinces and regions. I can tell you that for reasons I'm not specifying here, but I have already a very long term preview of what the random cycle has in store for us, and actually there's plenty of Eastern Roman warfare videos, including also the properly the late Roman army that I discussed again thanks to the cycle years ago a lot, but then the last years we haven't seen so much, so that's how random it can get. In spite, it's always something that can come up easily, like once a week, even without too much surprise. But at times you have this randomness of strangely concentrated similar topics out of random sources, right? That I use to in this way to sort of mix the whole thing. We look mostly at the frontier troops here, right? So a minimal word to be spent regarding the terminology. We are today, by the way, looking at the aforementioned provinces because they are fundamentally well organized from a military point of view, exactly for the roles of the Limitanei and the Ripenses, right? These people were facing with distinct threats. We will see, I don't know, in another bit is about Britain, about Africa. The Rhineland at this point was not so well put because of the invasions that were taking place exactly in that area. So we will deal with it with greater care somewhere else, right? Its extensive collapse, especially at the beginning of the 5th century, and as we've seen for the dating of the western half information of the Notitia, that's quite relevant. Referring to the terminology, Ripenses and Limitanei, right? Today we will make a long list of all the units in Latin that I will pronounce the sort of vulgar way rather than the classical one, because essentially from this point we think that things had started changing significantly. It's mostly just an hypothesis, but at least we have an idea of how this could have been pronounced at the time. So I know that most of you are likely familiar with the etymologies of the terms here. I don't have to specify too much, but for the sake of completion, right, I'll just lay this info out. So Ripenses and Limitanei were indeed used to refer to specific units within the late Roman army. We're talking essentially the Constantinian one, even though from the Theodosian era, I made multiple videos on that, things were sort of deteriorating, to say the least, especially in the West. So the Constantinian army had been a formidable war machine throughout the entire 4th century, essentially from the late 3rd to Adrianople. And the standards, the qualitative standards of the imperial army remained of the highest level until its end. You can argue that until there is a Roman state, there is essentially an updated Roman army. This was the most efficient part of the Roman state historically, all right? And lots of changes were going on. We can't quite simply see them today. I promise I have hundreds of videos in store just for the late Roman army, so we will deal with it gradually. And these terms, of course, refer to the roles and locations of the unit. The terminology was both militarily and administratively used, because, as you know, from the Diocletian and Constantinian reforms, you have essentially a territorialization of the Roman army, not just on on certain specific. Of course, there was a strategic deployment, but every district, right, of the empire was sort of militarized to a degree for providing with that amount of quota, the so-called capitatio iugatio, that is to say, on the basis of the people, and in proportion to the land, right, it was owned, and so a certain amount of these colonists at the end of the day under some senator had to be provided as records for the army. Quite complicated story in a moment of generalized crisis. I mean, the 4th century had been fundamentally a moment of great stability again until, in fact, the end, and so the time which we're documenting now. But that's exactly the ratio through which the term ripenses, ripari, and the limitanei was used, because, as you know, the limitanei is the more generic terminology for frontier troops from limes, even though it was a term that Romans didn't quite use as such, right? Especially at the beginning, their concept was rather the one of munimentum, right? So an idea of not of a defensive concept, of deterrent one, right? At this point, but that happened in a time in which, of course, the Roman army could project a massive strategic force far across the frontiers. At this point, instead, the empire is mostly on the defensive, and or at least has lost that capacity, and just out of very rational calculation of simply, being out there on the floor, and there are threats, not just much of barbarian invasion per se, but of rebellions. The stattal armories are being brought from the legionary camps from which they had already existed de facto in that centralized way in the core Mediterranean lands. Their workers are militarized as well. There is this insistence. It's just like if you look at the Theodosian Code and the so-called Perpetua Sanctio, they did it now, but this Byzantine idea now that the empire was crystallizing on the basis of a much more rigid oligarchic hierarchical system that was sanctioned by the new religious course with Christianity, emphasizing the sin, guilt of man, and the entrusting to the actual vicary of Christ that in the imperial tradition now was being actually the same emperor, rather than how it would happen in the West eventually with the papacy proper. It's a complex thing. I already discussed the of course, the division, the fact it was never such a thing like a union of church and state in Christendom. Actually, Christendom was born exactly to specify that, because it was not the case in pagan times, but our modernistic, complaining has sort of brought us to flip the coin, and never mind, just a little detail, right, of historical interpretation. But this whole dynamic had, as you know, notoriously resulted in the separation of some field army troops that were fundamentally stationed in the core land of the empire and had this dramatic projection capacity, and they were essentially elite troops to some extent. And the Limitanei instead were scattered across the frontier, and that weren't actually that bad, right? It is true that on average, of course, the comitatenses were better, but there were actually certain Limitanei units that had the finest equipment, training, and had nothing to feel less compared to the finest field armies, right? But there are exceptions, and we will, because I never actually made a video explaining this in detail, but I promise we will get to that. So, Ripenses, Limitanei, these terms are sometimes interchangeable and can overlap in their usages. So the Ripenses, also known as Riparienses or Ripari, were a specific type of frontier troops, called like this because it was predictably stationed along river banks. Right, the term Ripenses derives from the Latin word ripa, which means riverbank. Right, so another say station also along other water-based boundaries of some sort, and these units were tasked with defending these. In fact, against being essentially lodged there, right, to be defended by the same waterways against, in fact, incursions across the sea. And these troops were responsible for protecting areas to invasion or raids, primarily on the western frontier of the Roman Empire, because at least some of, as long as the Rhine frontier remained, this was somehow sort of greater concentration of forces, at least historically had been like that. The Danube is longer, and also the different settlement dynamics, etc., are making it in a relative different way. But of course, there were units of Ripenses, of course, referred to the Danube as well. We'll partly see some of them today. On the other hand, the Limitanei were frontier troops intended as stationed along the borders, the boundaries, the limits of the Roman Empire, hence their name, right? Generically, these troops were so responsible for the defense of the empire's frontiers. They could have Ripenses, as we've seen within them, and they had to maintain border security. In many ways, these troops had tended to sedentarize, right? The Limitanei were posted in fortified garrisons or small forts known as, at some point there, the limits, right, and playing a crucial role in the defense of the same. We will see how even the field armies actually were to be inherited as regional, provincial troops, forces, units by same Romano-Germanic kingdoms, right? And they maintained their own privileges as professional soldiers. That there was a status that was recognized, passed down the generations. Never really made a video about that, but somebody has asked me over the years, so I feel guilty now because I'm letting them down if they haven't left yet. So, as we've seen, repentance is more generally as a term associated with the defenders of riverbank areas, while the Limitanei, the more general term for frontier troops, right? Definitely, some repentances were considered as part of the Limitanei, as they were stationed basically on the same borders or near to them. However, not all Limitanei were repentances, right? So the distinction between the two lies in the specific role and location, nothing else. As I said before, we're looking essentially at ducal troops, right? Here, the point is that, according to the Notitia, the Limitanei and repentance forces were organized under the command of duces, right? In Latin, as you know, dux comes from the verb to lead, right? A bit like the Führer. In fact, you know, the duce was resumed also by the Italian fascists, exactly in this leadership reason, and it's a term that was re-emphasized in this late Roman administrative language because it was distinguishing, let's say, between this different shades of military command, right? The dux was the guy that was entrusted with sort of more strictly purely military power. That's a difference that the same Germans inherited. For example, the Franks had the counts, the Longobards had the dukes, right? It's similar things. Also about this, I cannot digress in depth, right? But the idea, especially in the Roman army at this point, is that the dux was actually sort of very important, of course, provincial commander, but less important than the comes as such. And depending, of course, of the type of hierarchy and offices, because these things could vary at different times, different offices could be received at different times. But given that there is this strict territorial districtuation, we can say, both administratively and militarily, in fact, local officials maintain a continuity for some time. Then we're lucky, of course, greatly to have the Notitia Dignitatum, but it's not entirely clear how the system had come to be this in detail, and how also it would evolve later times. If I'm not wrong, I'd make a bit about the Byzantine frontiers in Justinian times, right? So observing at that point even how more fragmented and just by lack of a broader reorganization and reform, that those same also Byzantine titles definitely had come to be. That's typical also throughout the Byzantine millennium, that specific tasks, offices at court or elsewhere were changing in function independently from the etymology of the name, right? And of course, this depended on practical issues that sometimes are also very much unknown. We just can document it at some point with very scanty evidence. In any case, these duchies were, we discussed today, and I listed before, were administrative and military regions, as we have seen, responsible for the defense of the Roman Empire's borders. The reason these forces were placed under the command of duces is mainly due to the same strategic importance of the border regions, hence the more strictly military task. The Limitanei were stationed along the frontiers to essentially defend against external threats, mostly, not only, right, also from internal ones. But in these provinces, in fact, the barbarian threats, so the external ones, were more pronounced. Thus, these forces played a crucial role in maintaining the security and integrity of the empire as such. Placing the Limitanei forces under the command of duces allowed for better organization, coordination, and control of these border defenses. The dukes had the authority to command and deploy these troops effectively, ensuring the protection of the borders. Additionally, by establishing military administrative units along the borders, the empire could effectively manage the defense and response against potential threats. Right? This is the point, right? The duches were like more provincial forces stationed again on a regular basis against what Ludwig would define low intensity threats. All right, whereas the field armies would arrive when major invasions with essentially against equivalent field armies from the barbarians would occur. It's typical, by the way, of the late Roman Empire, and as was pointing out for just the 6th century, just the one after the one we're discussing today, practically, had been evolving on the basis of there were some established units. Here we find still legions in the Notitia that existed in even late Republican times, and the tradition of the units had passed down. They had been shrunk, they had been sort of split, whatever. But the actual continuity existed, and it was gone throughout the centuries. But there were many other units that had been created essentially for this local commands that eventually were, I don't know, sent somewhere else, or bore the name again from the original unit, but they weren't quite the same unit. Also because the members were replenished in different ways. So it's sort of messed up. I will make other videos explain this in some greater depth. Right, for today we stick to the most just fixed evidence, that is the one of the Notitia. Then what happened before or later is something that requires a bit more of criticism. So the duchies, along with the respective commanders, were also responsible for maintaining the loyalty and discipline of the troops under their command, as well as coordinating with neighboring provinces and military units, so that they could just be integrated into a field army, right, under the command of course, of higher authority, including the imperial one that was just basically deputy to them, right, down at the hierarchical line. So the Notitia Dignitatum provides essentially just with a snapshot of the late empire's military organization between the late 4th, beginning of the 5th century AD. And this placement of Limitanei forces under duches is reflective of this period, and it would evolve both administratively and militarily with time. So we list now the units, tribunes, and prefects, together with the respective units, in fact, under the command of the dux provinciae Rhaetiae prime et secundae, that is to say, the Duke of the first and second provinces of Rhaetia, corresponding roughly to modern Switzerland. If you're interested in the later centuries, I made multiple videos about Alemannia and Alpine Rhaetia. I talk about medieval Swabia, etc., so you can check that out, but we'll come back on these topics soon as well, so for Celtic times, Roman times, etc. And so here are the units, and we're simply listing. We're not going to do much more than that. Equites Stablesiani Seniores, and I will give the name in the Latin source, plus the location, because we know where they were deployed. In this case, at Augustanes. Sometimes we do not know exactly what localities where the minor ones really were, but again, the Notitia says Equites Stablesiani Juniores at Ponte Aoni, now at Fabian. Equites Stablesiani Juniores at Submontorio. Prefectus Legionis Tertiae Italicae Parti Superioris at Castra Regina, that is Regensburg, famously enough, on the Danube, in fact. Prefectus Legionis Tertiae Italicae Parti Superioris Deputate Ripe Prime at muntorio. Prefectus legionis tertiae Italice pro parte media pretendentes from Vimania Cassiliacum to Cambidano. Prefectus militum Ursariensium at Guncie. Prefectus legionis tertiae Italice transvectionis Peserum deputate at Fetibus. Prefectus legionis tertiae Italice transvectionis specierum deputate at Terriolis. Prefectus alle prime Flaviae retorum at Quintanis. Naturally, you understand that aside from, we don't understand fully, right, how this, for example, the prefect forces here were exactly organized. That's the other point. We do not know exactly how numerous these forces were, right? There is all historiography that today I don't want to get into because it would be somehow messed up regarding how big were these forces, right, in practice, but also in theory, because it's easy to do that for, let's say, the Republican or early imperial times. It's not even technically that mathematical. We tend to fix some data in a very rigid schematic way, but of course every army is different historically, right? Even if roughly they were of the same size, like say the early imperial Roman legion of 5,500 men, still Roman armies were put in multiple one of those together. They had even a larger number of auxilia, and as I was saying before, some of these units here are essentially even pieces of others that had existed, that are subdivided, but maintaining the name and having, however, a different organic. All right. Tribunus cohortis nova Batavorum at Batavis, and by the way, consider in this sense that here the pairing, like you're say a cohorts would have just had its own commander, of course, but here in the late Roman titling, they added, it's not the cohort that eventually is led by this guy. It's just, yes, it's another way of saying it, but it's first of all the tribune, right? This is that has this cohort basically, and this is very much in tune with that sort of social certification, the idea that leaders were more important later on in moment of crisis, etc. So this reflects a bit, even just linguistically, that change. Tribunus cohortis tertiae Britorum at Abusina, prefectus alle secunde Valeriae singularis at Vallatio. As I said before, by the way, I'm pronouncing in the sort of ecclesiastical pronunciation because we are pretty late in time, so we prefer to do that, like from the 4th century onwards. That's at least approximately what we think had already happened linguistically in Romance. I think I said it, prefectus alle secunde Valeriae singularis at Vallatio, then tribunus cohortis sexte Valeriae retorum at Venaxamodorum, tribunus cohortis prime Herculeae retorum at Paraduno, tribunus cohortis quinte Valeriae frigum at Pinianis, tribunus cohortis tertiae Herculeae Pannoniorum at Celio. To realize here, even the subdivision, like this is the 3rd Herculean cohort of the Pannonians, right? Just think again how, given the Limitanei context here, how deeply also territorialized and or sort of characteristic, right, ethnically defined and or specified, even just maybe if, you know, the composition could vary, these guys came from somewhere else, but how it had been now box framed into this specific context as that specific unit, right? We don't get that, we don't get an equivalent of the Notitia Dignitatum for early imperial times, so we don't have to think that this was not a thing even before, right? But the idea that, again, the Roman army had somehow fragmented its unit historically, right, for different reasons, to intervene more surgically, capillarily across the frontier, and that's why this space is so important as well. but just the costs, right? It happens also with fleets. If you wonder even why the larger ships of the earlier days that were now not used anymore, that were smaller, it's not much a matter of cost, broadly meant. Is the different strategic and operational use that was made of them, and again, the general disintegration of the empire to some degree, starting from the frontier, right? That was the sort of most militarized, the least appealing, the one that sort of witnessed a quicker and had already had actually a lower degree of Romanization, with these guys sort of remaining there, at some point passing under the control of other polities that sort of either absorbed them or even maintained them, as we have seen in the Romano-Germanic kingdoms. Then you have Tribunus Gentis per Retias Deputate et Terriolis, Prefectus Numeri Barbaricariorum et Confluentibus or Brecantia, Prefectus ali secunde Valeria sequanorum at Vimania, Tribunus Cortis Herculae Pannoniorum at Arbore. Then passing to the Dux Valeriae Ripensis, so the Duke of the Riverine Valeria, corresponding essentially to modern central Hungary, right? And quite an important area, strategically speaking. One of the most militarized, say one of the least Romanized, but also in this sense more militarized and strategically relevant, as you know, for the occupation of the westernmost chunk of the Eurasian steppes. In fact, we see a lot of horsemen, by the way. See the difference with Rhaetia, right? It was sort of more, in fact, alpine, but also deeply continental, sort of more western reality, were infantry. Also, if you look at the enemies, right, the West Germans were, as you know, the one with sort of least cavalry. Well, the North Germans were, but compared to the Elbe Germans or the East Germans, right? Instead, in Hungary, what do you find? Cuneus equitum scutatorum et solue, Cuneus equitum dalmatarum et intercisa. Yes, it's the place from the famous sort of rank and file late Roman legionary helmet, right? One of the most famous from there. Cuneus equitum Constantianorum at Lusiona, that is essentially in Tercis as well. Cuneus equitum Stablesianorum at Ripa Alta, Conratua. Cuneus equitum Fortentium at Altino, equites Dalmate at Odiabo, equites Promoti at Crumero, equites Mauri at Solua, equites Dalmate ad Herculeum, equites Dalmate at Cirpe. These are all different units, right, of equites Dalmate, right? Equites Dalmate at Constantiae. I will say not repeat itself. Well, okay, it's alternating. At Campona, equites Promoti at Matrice, equites Dalmate at Vetusaline, equites Sagittari. These were horse archers, essentially, at Intercisa. And again, we don't have to be fooled by the name just per se. Again, these guys, both ethnically or tactically, could be something very different on the field from what the name says. But orientatively speaking, where you see here's the Pannonian area, you have Dalmatian cavalry of some sort, of course, was pretty close historically. Equites Dalmate at Namantia, Equites Dalmate at Lusonio, at Ripa Alta. These are all different units of Equites Dalmate at Statuas at Florentia. Equites Sagittari at Altino. You see that there are some places here that are recorded having, of course, multiple units garrisoned there. Now it's would be essentially the fort opposite Florentia. Equites Flavianenses ad militare, ad militare, auxilia Herculensia at ad Herculem. By the way, at would stand for the same ad, right? As a Latin preposition. Ad Herculem means at Hercules, basically. but we of course defined the locality ad Herculem, so you find it at Herculem. Auxilia Ursarentia at Ponenavata. Now it would be at Statuas. Auxilia Vigilum. This was in the frontier opposite to Aquincum. Auxilia Fortensia Sirpa, because by the way, here the terms are different, right? There is Acinco, but that would be Aquincum, that is, of course, in Budapest, actually the part on the left bank of the river. Auxilia Fortensia Cirpe, Auxilia Insidiatorum at Cardabiaca, because as I said before, the same texts that arrived to us through medieval sources were with some mistakes and misspellings or adaptations from Middle Latin, so you just can read these names in different ways. Then Prefectus Legionis Prime Adiutricis Cohortis Quinte Partis Superioris et Regetione, Prefectus Legionis Secundae Adiutricis Cohortis Partis Superioris at Alice, Prefectus Legionis Secundae Adiutricis Partis Inferioris at Florentia, Prefectus Legionis Secundae Adiutricis Tertiae Partis Superioris at Acinco, Prefectus Legionis Secundae Adiutricis in the castle opposite Thauthantum, Prefectus Militum Secundae Adiutricis at Cirpe, Prefectus Legionis Secundae Adiutricis at Lussonia, Prefectus Classis Istrice at Florentia. You see here there are, of course, some fleets, not just the riverine ones, because some areas of also the Mediterranean were fairly close, like in this case to the same sea, by the way. Then there is a list of tribuni of cohort that had a unit under their command, but the Notitia does not give us in name. These were stationed. We know Tribunus Cohortis, then we do not know the unit name. In all these localities, each at Vincenze, Quadriborgio, Iovia, Borgum Centenarium, Alesse, Marinane, then Prefectus Legionis, also in this case no unit number or name given, at Transiacinco. Then we have some cavalry units or detachments of the same listed under the command of the Duke of Second Moesia as a separated thing. We don't know exactly again why the Notitia says that there are various hypotheses, but they're somehow complicated just to descend in, and in any case we do not know. We are essentially northeast Bulgaria here. We have cavalry cunei, cuneus equitum scutariorum at Securisca, cuneus equitum Solentium at Dimo, cuneus equitum scutariorum at Latius, cuneus equitum Armigerorum at Sexaginta Prista, cuneus equitum secundorum Armigerorum at Tegra, cuneus equitum scutariorum at Appiara, and cuneus equitum Stablesianorum at Sucidava. So these are famous fortifications, by the way, of the Roman frontier. And along these cavalry units, we have auxiliary infantry or detachments of the same units. They are called milites, right? So consider at this time still infantry is the queen of battles, just to follow the quote of a famous historian. But of course, especially on these frontiers, cavalry is acquiring an ever greater importance, right? Never as much as in the 6th century, but we're getting there in direction. And you have noticed how even the scunei are, we see the scutariorum, armigerorum, so these were different terminologies, again, initially based on the different type of armament or equipment in general. The change also from the same conceptual definitions of Latin units that, as you know, took the name from weapons, not from shields, for example. But in late Roman times, things had changed somehow also. I mean, here we are in the East, and of course we're talking in times in which, of course, Constantinople had surpassed basically the other cities of the empire in political administrative importance. And as you know, it's not that these guys literally control what was happening in Britannia at the time, right, from there. And that's why these units are so important too, because they represent fundamentally, in some cases, exactly these years, for example, in the West, the fact that the burdens had been left out there on the road by the empire. With those units of essentially the Roman army, but essentially locally based, not being much greater forces, especially field armies. But going back to again the Duke of Second Moesia's auxiliary infantry units, we have these are all called milites. That again, remember that in medieval times, of course, they're famously knights, right, and mostly considered as cavalry, in fact. But of course, the initial Roman miles was an infantry. It was the legionnaire as such. So here we have the milites preventores at Ansamo, the milites Constantini at Trimamne, milites Dacici at Mediolana, milites terzi Navclari at Appiaria, milites novenses at Transmarisce, milites primi Mesiaci at Candidiana, milites Mesiaci at Teglico, milites quarti Constantiniani at Durostorum, milites Cimbriani at Cimbriani, milites Navclari Altinenses at Altino. So you see that some of these troops, and especially among the infantry auxiliary units, bear the name of in the same unit of the same unit from the place where they're stationed. So likely these were forces that had some sort of greater local attachment, as opposed to the cunei that as you've seen sometimes even have bore the ethnic name from adjacent provinces, not exactly those ones. This is quite fascinating. These are auxiliary units, by the way, which means that some of these forces were recruited also from locally, in a way. At this point, as you know, the distinction between citizenry, or even the concept of citizenry as such, and subject is basically lost, especially in the frontier. And I made a video about Maximin the Trajan that was explaining you how even after the Constitution Antoniniana, the sense was that within the Roman Empire there were some barbarians, or from ever, right, from those same populations. In that case, in the video of the Balkans, the Thracians, etc. So we should consider Vus a barbarian here, also in function of who had already been leading within the Roman Empire for centuries. But of course here was plenty of war bands from everywhere, from the Barbaricum, from Central, Northern, Eastern Europe, or even more far away, that would thicken the ranks, let's say. Then we find the prefects and their legionary units stationed along the same riverine frontier in Moesia. So obviously we're talking about the Danube. These are Prefectus Legionis Primae Italice at Novas, Prefectus Ripae Legionis Primae Italice Cortis Quinta, Pedature Superioris at Novas. Now this is very, very fascinating, because it's showing us that some of the original sort of legions had been split in cohorts that now were taking even the name of the riverine position in the full titling of the name. All right, this is really fascinating. Prefectus Ripae Legionis Primae Italice Cohortis Quinte Pedature Inferioris et Quadraginta Prista, Prefectus Legionis undecime Claudia at Durostorum, Prefectus Legionis undecime Claudia Cohortis Quinte Pedature Superioris at Transmarisce, Prefectus ripe legionis undecime Claudio Cortis quinte pedature inferioris et transmarisse, prefectus navium amnicarum et militum ibidem deputatorum. So the prefect of the ships, of the rivers, and of the soldiers deputed to those places. This is quite fascinating, right? And then we have in the Notitia, for the same sector, with the from a lesser register, in the province of Rhodope, the Cors Quarta Gallorum at Ulucitra. In the province of Thracia, the Cors Prima Aureliana under Radice Viamata, Cors Tertia Valeria Baccarum at Rasdes. Now, passing to Mesopotamia, the Duke of Mesopotamia, we find Equites Scutari Illyricani at Amide, Equites Promoti Illyricani at Resain Theodosiopolis, Equites Ducatores Illyricani Primi Ducatores at Amide, Equites Felices Honoriani Illyricani at Constantina. That here we have two units we do not understand exactly the because they are divergent, especially the latter. In one we have Apadna and Constantina, so these are just the places where they were, but the latter could be Ripalta as well. But I will not enter into the philological question of the manuscripts, because that's sort of a different story. You understand it's sort of notional for this video, but for the sake of completion, we point that out. The Equites Sagittari Indigene Arabanenses at Mefana Carta, Equites Scutari Indigene Pafenses at Assara, Equites Sagittari Indigene Tibitenses at Tilbisme, Equites Sagittari Indigene at Tannuri, Prefectus Legionis Prime Partice Nisi Bene at Constantina, Prefectus Legionis Secunde Partice at Cefe, together also in this case with some units from a lesser register that are documented for the Duchy of Mesopotamia, including the Ala Secunda Nova Egyptiorum at Carta, the Ala Octava Flavia Francorum at Ripalta, the Ala Quintadecima Flavia Carduenorum at Caini, Cors Quinquagenaria Arabum at Betalla, Cors Quartadecima Valeria Zabdenorum at Maicarii. Then we get, for the Duchy of Armenia, it was a bit tinier, the Equites Sagittaria Zambu, the Equites Sagittaria Domana, the Prefectus Legionis Quintadecime Apollinaris at Satala. Here we are on the far eastern frontier, the Mashrek. Prefectus Legionis Duodecime Fulmine at Melitene. This is Melitene. You understand that these would have been also important fortresses later on in medieval times for the Byzantines and so on. We get some units and officers with men recorded separately as being in Pontus, so that we do not quite get here the duchy as such, but we know that there were these forces. The Prefectus Legionis Prime Pontice at Trapezunta, the Ala Rizena, the Ala Dale Arizza, the Ala Theodosiana near Anaxam, the Ala Felix Theodosiana at Silvanis. And then there is a lesser register here too, documented. The Ala Prima Augusta Colonorum at Chiaca, the Ala Auriana at Dascusa, the Ala Prima Ulpia Dacorum at Suissa, the Ala Secunda Gallorum at Eliana, the Ala Castello Tablariensi Constituta, importantly enough, this refers literally to a castle that had been established there, these guys. The ala prima pretorica nuper constituta, cors tertia ulpia miliaria Petraeorum at Metita, di cors quarta retorum at Analiba, di cors militaria Bosporiana at Arauraca, di cors miliaria Germanorum at Sicila, alia prima Iovia Felix at Cassanenica, di ala prima Felix Theodosiana at Pythie, di cors prima Theodosiana at Valencia, di cors Apuleia Civium Romanorum at Isiporto, di cors prima Lepidiana at Cene Parembole, cors prima Claudia Equitata at Sebastopolis, cors secunda Valentiniana at Ziganne, and di cors Mocora. For the Duchy of Arabia, we have the Equites Scutarii Illirici at Animota, the Equites Promoti Illiriciani at Tricoma, the Equites Dalmati Illiriciani at Ziza, the Equites Mauri Illiriciani at Aeropolis, the Equites Promoti Indigene at Speluncis, the Equites Promoti Indigene at Mefa, the Equites Sagittarii Indigene at Gadda, the Prefectus Legionis Tertiae Cyrenaicae at Bostra, the Prefectus Legionis Quarte Marsi at Bethor, the Equites Sagittarii Indigene at Diaphanes. We have a lesser register also for the Duchy of Arabia, counting the ala nona miliaria. You see here there is a prevalence of apparently smaller troops in these lesser registers, but that may have not been that less relevant, especially in frontier warfare, if they were mounted, etc. The ala sexta Hispanorum at Goma, the ala secunda Constantiniana at Libona, the ala secunda Miliarensis at Nars Fari, the ala prima Valenciana at Tainata, the ala secunda Felix Valentiniana near Aditta, the cors prima Miliaria Tracum at Adita, cors prima Tracorum at Sabaia, cors octava Voluntaria at Balta, cors tertia Felix Arabum, on essentially the bank of the Vade Faris River at Camp Arnonensibus, cors tertia Alpinorum near Arnorn. Then we have the Duchy of Thebes, that is the Egyptian Thebaid, right? So this controlled say the Nile Valley, right, in the south, from the attack of peoples like it had been the Blemmyes, etc. And here we have the Cuneus Equitum Maurorum Scutariorum at Lycon, the Cuneus Equitum Scutariorum at Hermopoli, the Equites Sagittarii Indigene at Tentira, the same names that for different unit each at Copto Diospolis, Latus Maximianopolis, then the Equites Promoti Indigene, Legio Tertia Diocletiana at Ambos, Legio Secunda Flavia Constantia Thebaeorum at Cusas, Legio Tertia Diocletiana at Presentia, Legio Secunda Traiana at Apollonos Superioris, Milites Miliarenses at Siene, Legio Prima Valentiniana at Copto, Legio Prima Maximiana at Filas, Legio Tertia Diocletiana at Thebas, Legio Secunda Valentiniana at Ermunthi, Equites Felices Honoriani at As Finis, ala prima Abasgorum at Hibeo Oesos Maioris. We have a lesser register with some other units, Ale and Cohortes, ala secunda Hispanorum at Paesari Thenidos, ala Germanorum at Pescla, ala quarta Britonum at Isiu, ala prima Iberorum at Mu, alla Neptunia at Cenobossa, alla Tertia Dromedariorum at Maximianopolis, alla Octava Palmyrenorum at Phoenicionis, alla Septima Herculia Voluntaria opposite Lata, alla Prima Francorum opposite Apollonos, alla Prima Iovia Cataphracta at Panpene, alla Octava Abidum at Abosedo, alla Secunda Herculia Dromedariorum at Psinaula, alla Prima Abasgorum at Oasi Maiore, alla Prima Quadorum at Oasi Minore, Trimtheos, alla Prima Valeria Dromedariorum. Here you see definitely we have cataphracts, dromedaries, and sort of other units that suggest sort of the, interestingly enough, as we've seen, even named after German troops, Spanish ones, etc. We have seen this alla Prima Valeria. Okay, sorry. The alla Prima Abasgorum at Oasi Maiore, alla Prima Quadorum at Oasi Minore, Trimtheos, okay. Alla Prima Valeria Dromedariorum at Precteos, Cors Prima Lisitanorum at Terraco, Cors Scutata Civium Romanorum, interestingly enough, at Muteos, Cors Prima Apamenorum at Silili, Cors Undecima Camavorum at Peamo, Cors Nona Zanorum at Nitnum, Cors Nona Alamanorum at Burgo Severi, Cors Prima Felix Theodosiana near Elephantine, Cors Quintas Swensium at Suene, Cors Secta Saginarum in Castris Lapidariorum, and Cors Septima Francorum at Diospolis. Now this is interesting because the name of these latter of the Thebaid units are very international, right? Lots of Germans, one unit of Roman citizens, literally. Spanish, we see guys coming from other places, say in the Levant. We see troops from the same Egypt, so also recruited likely in Loco, or maybe because they were named after the place where they were stationed. So it's complex just to look at the composition of each, but this video was just to offer a glimpse of the sort of complexity also of the various units that were deployed, right, were maintained in these frontiers from essentially the Limitanei, the Repenses, whenever they were settled in proximity of, again, this water. So this is just the beginning. Again, the reason why I make these videos that do not seem to go like to any specific point aside from providing with this sort of list and idea of completion is exactly the fact that the sort of system as such has to be completed. In fact, if anyone wants to know, but how was actually the late Roman army organized, what did the Notitia Dignitatum say in detail, because of course I will make videos about all these various units in theory, but also in some aspects of it, their practice, and we will name them at some point, etc. But also just looking at which one they were and how they were organized. I don't know, I think it can be an interesting resource, right? I don't know how in the future people will interact with YouTube, because it's all quite blurred at this point. So you're lucky if you have some money on your own, or better, actually much better, like property possessions. But we're not really in the best of times, we can say, for the average person, and because of the average person. But aside from this, I hope that Schwerpunkt can remain an important point of reference for anyone who's interested in history and can look at the content in a sort of encyclopedical way, right? So that I will have done this also, right? And it's part of the game. For today, thus, I stop it here. We'll hopefully talk soon about these topics. As I said before, there is more Eastern Roman stuff especially coming, but also migration here, etc. For today, stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like and subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.